Thank you for watching us on YouTube. But did you know that if you're on the go, you can get the full show as a podcast now? You can get our morning breakdown of the most important topics facing our country, news not being covered by the mainstream media, interviews with change-making progressives, and info on what you can actually do about all this. Search for The Damage Report on your favorite podcast app and subscribe so you know when new episodes are ready to go. Okay, I could not be more excited to welcome to The Damage Report our next guest, the author of books like, most recently, The Battle for Paradise, as well as Shock Doctrine, No Is Not Enough, and a number of other books that you're probably familiar with if you're watching the show. Author and social activist Naomi Klein joins The Damage Report now.
Hi.
I'm very excited to have you here, especially considering the context that we're in as a country, where we have been hit recently by another hurricane. We see Donald Trump going to the affected areas, deploying all of his social media weight to try to put across the idea that he is taking these sorts of disasters seriously. But we have not forgotten what happened last year with Puerto Rico and Hurricane Maria. This is something that you've written about extensively and gets into one of your main topics of writing, which is disaster capitalism. For people who might not be familiar with that term, what is that a reference to?
Right. So I started using the term disaster capitalism in 2004, and it was referencing the Asian tsunami that happened on Christmas Eve in 2004, which was a devastating natural disaster, but which was exploited, which was harnessed to grab land from fishing people, small plot farmers, and turn it into tourism resorts and things like that. And so disaster capitalism, or I sometimes use the term the shock doctrine, as you know, is this strategy of exploiting moments of profound crisis, of collective trauma. It could be a natural disaster, it could be a profound economic crisis, it could be a war, but a situation in which people are necessarily focused on their daily emergencies, the daily effort of staying alive, and using that dislocation and trauma to push through a wish list of pro-corporate policies and to profit in various ways from disaster.
Well, we've certainly got an example of that. I mean, what happened to Puerto Rico is just about as bad of a disaster as you can imagine, not just in terms of how they were hit by the hurricane, but the lack of interest on the part of the government, the lack of a willingness to do what's necessary to stop people from dying. They spent months without access to electricity and other basic services. So in your analysis of Puerto Rico and the attempted recovery from that last hurricane, are we seeing an influx of disaster capitalists?
Well, absolutely, we are. We are seeing this strategy unfold in real time now, where there was a pre-existing agenda to attack the public sphere in Puerto Rico, to radically shrink the public sector, that whether in education or healthcare, and the disaster has been used as the pretext to push through that agenda. But in Puerto Rico, you have a particularly severe case of this because the story really doesn't start with Hurricane Maria. It starts with the debt crisis that began to spiral out of control in the decade before Maria, right? But even before Maria, people were talking about Puerto Rico as this textbook example of the shock doctrine, because the debt, which was not accumulated by ordinary Puerto Ricans, but was, the fault of, the laws that were put in place to turn Puerto Rico into tax haven, and also an economic crisis that was imposed on Puerto Rico by Washington when they allowed a series of tax breaks to expire, and there was a capital flight where all of these factories closed and people lost a large number of jobs in Puerto Rico. So this really is starting in 2006. It started to get really bad. Then the worldwide economic crisis made it even worse, and then Puerto Rico tried to borrow its way out of it. A lot of the debt is considered to be illegal by many experts, but it reaches this absolutely unpayable sum of 77 billion by some counts, and so on. So what's important to understand here is the way in which the debt was being exploited well before Maria to radically weaken the public sphere, right? So the reason why the storm had such a profound impact is not just because it was a record-breaking storm, but because Puerto Rico's public infrastructure was already so neglected and under attack when the storm hit. So on a good day, the electricity system wasn't functioning well in Puerto Rico, and the storm functioned as the last straw. So you have a lot of converging forces. You have a legacy of colonialism and an economy that is really built to be dependent. So you have this very fertile island that is importing 85% of its fuel and more than 85% of its food and more than 95% of its fuel, even though it could have 100% renewable energy just from the sun and the wind on the island. So it's built to be dependent. It's built to be a captive market. It's already in the midst of this brutal austerity program. And then Maria slams headlong into that. And then, as you said, the so-called recovery effort really reflected this same disdain for Puerto Ricans and for Puerto Rican institutions.
So I think that you've perfectly laid out what the possible recovery that's been set up for might look like. But there is at least one other potential path for recovery that's been advocated by politicians like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez recently, where she has been pushing for something akin to a Marshall Plan for Puerto Rico, to put it on the path not just for recovery, but for sustainability in terms of energy and environment and all of that. Do you think that some sort of sustained large-scale influx of money and aid from the government could help Puerto Rico? And if so, what form should that take to actually do what's necessary for the island?
Right, and I think that the bill that she is referring to, which was drafted, by Bernie Sanders and Senator Warren as well, it is one that comes actually from below. It comes from Puerto Ricans who have been organizing and demanding this type of response, right? And this is why it is so important to understand that this is not, an act of God, a natural disaster. There's really nothing natural about the extent of the catastrophe in Puerto Rico. You have all these unnatural forces that I was just describing, right? Of the way in which the public sphere suffered from this program of economic punishment that made it so much more vulnerable. But even the storm itself can't just be called a natural disaster any more than any of the storms that we're seeing now, like Florence or last year with Irma or Harvey. What climate scientists are telling us is that every storm now is being supercharged by climate change, because the storms are coming from an ocean that is warmer and sea levels are higher. So every storm is an abnormal storm now. And so that's not natural either. That's not God that did it. It's governments at the behest of the fossil fuel companies that pay for their campaigns. So we need to understand the forces that created this catastrophe, because it should inform our response, right? So we have the Trump administration that just wants more of the same, right? More fossil fuel pollution, more disaster capitalism. But I think what's compelling about that Green New Deal or that Marshall Plan, that Green Marshall Plan for Puerto Rico, is that it is about learning from this catastrophe and coming up with a recovery, a justice-based recovery that actually gets at the underlying causes, that cuts pollution, that moves Puerto Rico to renewable energy, but also invests in the public sphere that has been so neglected, as opposed to the plan that's actually on the table, which is to sell off the electricity grid to the highest bidder.
I'm glad that you brought up justice there, because we know from endless examples that although disasters can happen anywhere, technically, they certainly seem to hit certain areas harder, and the recovery certainly seems to be less of a focus when it's a certain type of person along a few different lines of demographics. And there, obviously, I'm referring to both class and race. You've talked about disaster capitalism in many different parts of the world, different examples. Is that a big part of this, exploiting certain types of communities? Or when it comes to disaster capitalists, are they pretty much, they'll go anywhere where the money takes them?
I don't think it is by any means a coincidence that the communities that have seen the heaviest dose, of this kind of profiteering and really trauma exploitation are places that are majority people of color, whether we're talking about Puerto Rico or whether we're talking about New Orleans in the aftermath of Katrina, where, as I wrote about in the shock doctrine, a Republican state congressperson in Louisiana famously said, we couldn't clean out the public housing projects, but God did, right? As if this was a gift from God to be able to bulldoze the public housing and replace it with condominiums. So, it is not by accident that this happens in majority Black and brown cities and islands. But I also think it's important not to romanticize what is happening right now in North Carolina, or what's happening, what happened in Texas. I mean, that all was not rosy there. And we're hearing horror stories about the treatment of inmates, where you have essentially slave labor helping to prepare for these storms, filling sandbags to prepare communities and then not evacuating prisoners. There was a horrifying report just in the last couple of days of 2 mentally ill women who were chained in the back of a van that took on water, and they drowned while the officers who were transporting them in chains were rescued. So I think what we're seeing is that what these mega disasters do is they exacerbate pre-existing inequalities. And in Puerto Rico, you had huge inequalities because it is a colony. So in the inequalities between the relationship with mainland United States. And so all of that has been exacerbated. But even within the disasters happening, whether it's wildfires in California or floods in the Carolinas, we are seeing the same impact.
Well, Naomi Klein, author of The Battle for Paradise, as well as many other incredibly important and necessary books. Thank you for joining us and helping update us on what's going on in Puerto Rico.
My pleasure. Great to talk with you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for watching this clip from The Damage Report. If you liked it, don't forget to subscribe to this channel and ring the bell on YouTube to get notifications of our new videos. And of course, you can catch the full Damage Report live every weekday at 1 p.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Pacific on TYT Network on YouTube TV.